Okay, hello again, Ling 201. Today we're going to talk about ambiguity as well as something called subcategorization. And before we do this lecture, you should take a gander at this quick write, number 21, the one about the little girl who wants to play tennis really badly. Haha. That's a nice little example of ambiguity, and I'll walk you through exactly why it's ambiguous by the time we get to the end of this lecture, hopefully. And also here's a nice little Dr. Seuss graphic to keep you inspired as we go. Okay, so last time, or at least in the last lecture, we talked about how to portray the entire structure for, or the syntactic structure for an entire sentence. And we specified that at the top level, there's something called a TP, or a tense phrase. So the TP is headed by a T slot, which sometimes has an explicit verb in there, and then sometimes just has a feature saying plus or minus past. So when it does have an explicit verb in there, it can be filled with what are called auxiliary verbs. So there's two auxiliary verbs, which sometimes are called helping verbs in English class, if you've heard that term before. These two verbs are be and have, and they come in different forms because, well, in part because they're used quite often. They can take different sort of irregular inflections. So like be, you can see as am, are, is, was, were, so on and so forth. That's not really the main point of what I want to talk about at the moment. I'm just going to say that when verbs following these auxiliaries, the verbs that follow these auxiliaries bear affixes marking them for tense or voice, so on and so forth, like I am going, he has gone, so on and so forth. So the verb itself will do something a little bit different to sort of agree with the verb that's in the tense slot, the auxiliary verb and the main verb of the sentence. There's other auxiliary verbs, though, that are a special kind of auxiliary verb. They're called modals. They're verbs like will, would, can, could, shall, should, may, might, must, so on and so forth. To a certain extent, they kind of look like they're in present and past form themselves. Not quite, but the main point of talking about modals is that when there's a verb following a modal that's in the T slot of the sentence, that verb has to be in its root or infinitive form. So you can say I must go, or I could go, I shall go, so on and so forth. That go is not going to change form, even though it changes or it can change form if it's preceded by a be or a have verb in that T slot. There's also another verb, do or did, which can fit into this T slot, which is not normally considered a modal verb, but when it's in that T slot, the verb after it meets this property as well. It's always going to be in the infinitive form. So no inflectional affixes or changes to it from its root form. I'm going to say more about do and did in the next lecture as well, because it'll pop up in certain cases where it didn't exist before, and that's when we talk about transformations, how we can kind of relate two different forms of a sentence to each other. So I'll just mention this here as we go. These are the two kinds of verbs you might be looking for, and we're also, like I said last time, if you have like that plus past or minus past feature, there has to be agreement between those features and the verb in the main verb phrase of a sentence. There has to be some agreement here in terms of these other features, but we're not going to trouble ourselves with that in this class because we're just working on intro linguistics for the moment. If you're worried about that, you can always keep taking syntax at higher levels in the program if you want. Okay, so I want to say, though, that to a certain extent, the specific words that fill in the slots that we're portraying in these tree structures for sentences actually do matter to how the different structures can fit together. So there's some limitations on the extent to which the rules can just ignore which words are fitting into each phrase. So we kind of saw this a little bit from the Mad Libs quick write last week, or whenever you did it. So here's an example where somebody wrote or came up with, in some countries you can have by pulling a pretty home with your George. Ain't that the truth? But it's a little bit odd. You can kind of try to make some sense of this, but normally you can't just have without having something. So yeah, I'll also point out here that this is a modal verb. This is the infinitive form of the verb. Here's another example. In other countries, people swim a carcass by placing a red box next to a top hat. So this would almost work, except can you really swim a carcass, and what exactly would that mean? Are you like swimming with pulling a carcass behind you? I don't know. Let's hope not. At any rate, these verbs aren't really fitting into these frames appropriately, even though they're kind of not making it as ungrammatical as we often think about. And what's going on here is this phenomenon of subcategorization, which I was mentioning at the top of the slides here. So we have to actually break lexical categories down a little bit further than just verbs, nouns, adjectives, prepositions, so on and so forth. And we're going to have different kinds of verbs. So this is something you might already know about. Like if you go and look up a listing for a verb in a dictionary, it'll tell you what kind of verb it is. Some verbs, it turns out, have to be followed by a noun phrase of some sort. So you can say, I devoured the sandwich, or I invited the teacher, but you wouldn't just say I devoured or I invited. It's a little bit different from the verb eat. So you can say like I ate the sandwich, and maybe you can say I ate just by itself, but devoured never works in that fashion. So this gets a star because it's ungrammatical. On the other hand, there are other verbs that should never be followed by a noun phrase. So you can say I sprinted, or I slept, I danced, but you can't say I sprinted the ball, or I slept the dog, or I danced the horse. That doesn't work. For some of these, you can say put a preposition in here, which would make it make more sense, like I slept with the dog. Yeah, but that's not a noun phrase, right? So it's working slightly differently there. So the first type of verb, or the second set here, sprinted, slept, dance, those are called intransitive verbs, and they must not be followed by an MP. That is to say, they do not take an object noun phrase as a complement in the verb phrase. So you can represent those if you want with V sub I here, where the I stands for intransitive. And this is how you can write out the syntactic rule if you want. A VP with one of these as its head just has that as a head and nothing as its complement, like the NP. Some other examples would be like sneeze, fall, elapse, like time elapsed, time didn't elapse the hour or something like that, snorkel, so on and so forth. So here's a couple other bad examples, like the girl fell, but the girl fell the dog. That doesn't work. So these are intransitive verbs, and the other side of that equation is transitive verbs. So these are verbs that have to take an object NP as the complement in their noun or verb phrase. So if you want to write out the rule for these, you can write it out with a V sub T here, where V sub T is the head of the verb phrase. So you have to have a noun phrase complement here. You can't just have a bare transitive verb by itself. If you do, it sounds bad. So we saw the example of like devour or invite before. Harm is another example. So you can say the children harmed the dog, but you can't say the children harmed. That's odd. Or the zombies devoured the vampires. You can't just say the zombies devoured, even though that's kind of what they do. Okay, so the last example is ditransitive verbs. And these are interesting because they have two objects as we normally think about them, and they come in different syntactic forms. You can kind of switch back and forth between the two of them. So you either get two noun phrases in a row or a combination of noun phrase and prepositional phrase. So the die here just means two objects, basically. Two, and then transitive, which means it takes an object. So you can represent this with V sub DT. If you're going to write this out in terms of its phrase structure rules, it's actually going to look a little bit different from what we've normally seen. I'm not going to dwell on these too much for that reason, because we're kind of trying to keep things a little bit simple for your sake. What it would look like, though, is V sub DT and then two noun phrase objects, or a noun phrase object and a prepositional phrase object. Some examples of these types of verbs we give: sell, send, put, so on and so forth. So you can say the boy gave the dog a bone. It would be a little bit odd, or maybe wouldn't mean exactly the same thing if you say the boy gave the dog. Normally when you say something like this, I think people think of like the boy was making a donation of the dog of some sort, so the boy gave the dog to the homeless shelter, maybe, I don't know, something like that. So there's kind of an extra object here which you're just not expressing, and the context kind of fills it in. Or you can say like the student sold a chew toy to the professor. The student sold the professor a chew toy, something, so on and so forth. You can't, well, it'd be, again, tricky to say the boy gave the dog or the student sold a chew toy just by itself. It'd be really weird to say the student sold to the professor without saying something else, or the boy gave to the homeless shelter. Yeah, maybe. Give is a little flexible here. These others, not quite so much. Either way, what you're getting out of this is a case where you can have a verb which basically takes two objects or two complements. There's a few complement requirements we see in other lexical categories as well. These aren't as common or not commonly as strict as they are for verbs. So I've got one example here of an adjective which needs to take a particular prepositional phrase. So fond, we saw this one I think before, but Mary is fond of John. You can't just say Mary is fond or Mary is fond by John. It has to take a prepositional phrase that is headed with of. Also, here's some nouns that can require specific prepositional phrases. So George talked about our reliance on oil. You can't just say George talked about our reliance, or George talked about our reliance for oil. You have to say on oil in this, or on of something in this particular case. So if we think about it, since these can't be, you can't just simply have, or it doesn't make sense, I guess, to say have a specific rule for a specific lexical item. Instead, you just say, well, in our lexicon, in our mental dictionary, we have specific information about these individual words to tell us what kind of prepositional phrases they can be followed by. So that's, again, something you just have to know in order to be a competent speaker of a language. There's also a fourth type here, which is what we're going to kind of dwell on for a bit, fourth type of verb subcategory, which is sentential verbs. So in these, we don't get a noun phrase or a prepositional phrase. We get a whole sentence as a phrase, basically, which is why we have V sub S here. I guess in theory, you could say it's a whole TP as a complement, but it's actually going to have to be expanded a little bit from what we already know. So I'll give you some examples like know, believe, wonder, think, so on and so forth. So Marge thinks that Homer ate the cake. So these are interesting because you have Marge thinks, that could be a sentence by itself. And then we have another sentence embedded in that sentence, Homer ate the cake, which I'm bracketing out here as a TP. And then these are linked with this interesting little word that. I'll give you some other examples with different linking words. So Don wondered whether Sydney scored a goal. Again, this is a sentence by itself, another sentence by itself embedded in the bigger sentence. And then the linking word is whether, or maybe Phoebe believed that Chandler married Monica, or Gandalf asked if Frodo had the ring, so on and so forth. These are all basically working the same way. Again, it kind of depends on the specific kind of verb we're working with here. And then there's also these linking words here to put two sentences together. So I've made that explicit here in the notes. The VP complement is always preceded by a funny kind of word, that, whether, if. And those words we're going to call complementizers. And we're going to abbreviate them with just a C. So if, that, and whether. And I'm going to mention here as I go back, Marge thinks that Homer ate the cake. So this is the most common kind of complementizer we're going to see, this word THAT. It looks exactly the same as the word that, like that dog. But if you listen closely, it's actually pronounced in a slightly different way. So Marge thinks that Homer ate the cake, that it's more of a that than a that. So you could actually hear it a little more explicitly if you put the two next to each other. So if you say Marge thinks that that dog ate the cake, that, yeah, this is a that, the other one is a that. And this one is a complementizer. It works syntactically by sort of providing a link between an embedded clause and a larger clause in a sentence. So complementizers, we're going to add another level of structure here. We can call it CP. They're complementizer phrases. And they're going to function as the heads of these complementizer phrases. And then the complementizer phrase itself has a complement, which is a whole sentence, a TP in our terminology. So Marge thinks that Homer ate the cake. Homer ate the cake is a sentence by itself, a TP, and the complementizer is a CP. So it's a phrase kind of above a whole sentence level, and it's headed by the word that. So to have some terminology whereby we can talk about this sort of structure, this highest level sentence I'm going to call the matrix clause. the highest level TP, so Marge thinks, and then the embedded sentence is simply the embedded clause, or perhaps the complement clause. So Homer ate the cake is embedded in this higher level sentence structure for Marge thinks that Homer ate the cake. What does this look like? Pretty much what we've seen before. The trick, so at the top level, we have a TP, and it has Marge as its subject. It's a present tense verb, thinks, so that all looks the same. One thing I'm going to add here, though, is that I'm abbreviating the structure for the NP Marge. I'm not breaking it down into N bar and N there. Just sort of a shorthand for syntactic structures and sentences to just put a triangle here rather than breaking it all the way down. I'm just trying to save some space and time that way. You see it also here for Homer and the cake. Say more about that in a second. What I really want to focus on here is this CP complement of the verb phrase. So Marge thinks could be a sentence by itself. How do we fit the other sentence into it? We say this complementizer phrase is a complement of the V bar. And then that has an extra level of structure here. Like we said, the complementizer phrase is headed by the word that. That's a C. Or sorry, that is a C. And then its complement is this TP, the embedded phrase. So that, it's hard to kind of squeeze it in here, which is why I'm doing this abbreviation trick. But that is Homer ate the cake. So we have Homer as a subject. It's a past tense verb, ate. And then the complement of ate is the cake, which is also abbreviated here. So this is our matrix clause at the highest level. And then this is our embedded clause down here. And here's our little link to get the two to work together. Hopefully that makes sense, but you can always ask questions on email or in the comments. But we're going to see a lot of these. So I want you to make sure that you understand this structure before we move on. Okay, with this structure in hand, though, what we can do is create another form of infinite recursion. One that's a little more interesting, actually, than the noun phrase infinite recursion we saw last time. So you can actually, we've got one sentence embedded within another sentence here. As you might imagine, you could embed another sentence within this embedded sentence and so on and so forth and just keep on going infinitely. So you can embed complementizer phrases within complementizer phrases. So John said that Mary thought that Robin knew, that Angela hoped, that Quentin wished, that Bronwyn believed, that so on and so forth. So this VP expands into a V and a CP, and then that CP expands into a C and a TP, and that TP expands into a noun phrase and a verb phrase, and that verb phrase in turn expands into a verb and a complementizer phrase. And this is what it looks like on the surface, but it just keeps on going and going and going and going and going, or as long as you want to until finally you run out of breath and decide to end the sentence, whatever it might be. Okay, so there's another very boring way that we could produce infinitely long sentences in language. And this is probably the least interesting way to do it, but it uses a structure which will be helpful for us to know. So you can say, I like baseball and basketball and hockey and football and soccer and rugby and cricket and ultimate and polo and lacrosse, so on and so forth, just like a little kid. And this one's pretty easy to see and hopefully easy to understand as well. You're just adding and something else to it as you go. So what this is called is coordination, which uses the special lexical category of what's called conjunction words, like and, but, or. So they're basically combining, when you coordinate in syntax, you combine phrases or words of the same type with one of these conjunction words. And then you create a phrase or a word of the same type out of that. And we saw this as a potential test of phrase structure in syntax before. So there's nothing new here particularly. We just have to find out how we actually want to represent this in our syntactic structure. So the rule is going to look like this. You have some category X to the end. Either it's just X by itself or an XP or an X bar. And then you take that category and you can add a conjunction and then something else of the exact same category, and you get a higher level structure of the same category. It's probably going to be easier for you to see than it is for me to draw it out in bracket notation like that. So I'll give you a few examples. A noun phrase could be two noun phrases coordinated with each other, like the fat man and the little boy. Or you can get two VPs like fish or cut bait. to tense phrases as well, like Ringo plays drums, but Paul plays bass, so on and so forth. These are two individual sentences on their own, but you can say them together if you want. Just add but. And the coordination of individual words works the same way. So it's at a lower level, but you can say she went above and beyond the call of duty. So this functions like a preposition here in this sort of syntactic context, but there's two prepositions embedded in it with the word and conjoining the two. Okay, so this leads to a simple kind of structural ambiguity, which is the example that I talked about before, but also the example picture at the very beginning of this set of slides, like I like green eggs and ham. What exactly does that mean? Like I said, when I was a little kid, this always kind of drove me up the wall. I guess I wasn't really a big fan of Dr. Seuss, but whatever. So you can say I like green eggs and ham, where according to this bracketing notation, the green just attaches to the eggs here, but not the ham. So the ham is not green, which is probably good, but I think Dr. Seuss would prefer that it was. And then the other interpretation has that option in it. So I like green eggs and ham. So both the eggs and ham here would be green. How are we going to represent this? This is kind of the first example and pretty much the only example we're going to see where we have kind of a three-way branching structure under a node in a syntactic tree. But this is I like green eggs and ham. So this is the first interpretation where the green just attaches to the eggs. So the green is an adjective phrase by itself, and I'm using this shorthand notation here. And it is only working as a specifier for the word eggs, but not for the word ham. So I could get rid of this green if I wanted to. So try to imagine that it's not here, and you can say I like eggs and ham. So in that case, we can focus on just this coordination structure here. So we have one NP eggs conjoining with the other NP ham. There's a three-way structure, NP, conjunction, NP, and that all just combines into one big NP. So you can replace this whole thing, which is another NP, like I like ham, or I like eggs, so on and so forth. Yeah, I'm going to show you the other structure as well. So in this case, the green is functioning as a specifier for this individual noun phrase, which breaks down to specifier in this n bar. And you can conjoin two n bars with each other too if you want. So I like green eggs and ham, where both the eggs and the ham are going to be green in this case. I wanted to say this before, and also before we move on. So I've got this little triangle structure here for green. I'm actually going to go back to one we saw before and tell you that when you are writing out your syntactic trees for this class, well, you should recognize what this means, but please don't actually use it in your homework exercises or on your final exam. So like the cake here, there's a determiner here followed by a noun. We've seen that structure a lot. Please just break this all down so we can see the explicit structure when you write out your syntactic tree. I'm just trying to keep it short here so I can fit it into the slide. Yeah, just in case there's any confusion about that. Okay, so we've seen coordination, how that works, and we've also seen how it explains this type of ambiguity. We can try another one. So this is going to work slightly differently, and we're going to see a new structure with it as well. So we've got the police shot the terrorists with rifles. What does that mean? Who has the rifles? So is it the terrorists or is it the police? Yeah, so in one case, the terrorists have the rifles. So there's terrorists with rifles running around the town, and the police shot them with their handguns or maybe a cannon or who knows what. So in this case, if the terrorists are the only people who have the rifles, then with rifles is going to be a prepositional phrase embedded in the object and P noun phrase of shot. In the other interpretation, we have a slightly different structure, and we're going to use slightly different terminology for it too. So here, with rifles is something that is modifying the verb shot rather than modifying the object of the sentence, the terrorists. So the police shot the terrorists with rifles. The police have the rifles. Who knows what the terrorists have? Maybe some plutonium. But in this case, with rifles is in the hands of the police, and they're using it to do the shooting. So that's a prepositional phrase, which we say is modifying that main verb phrase. So it's going to fit in slightly differently here than what we've seen before. So here's our whole sentence. The police shot the terrorists with rifles. So past tense verbs, so on and so forth. And this is kind of the crucial structure here that we're worried about. With rifles is a prepositional phrase, and it fits in as the complement of terrorists in this whole noun phrase. And if we are attaching or sort of using the PP to modify this verb shot, it's actually going to link up in a slightly different fashion than what we've seen before. We're going to push it all the way up here to link up with the VP node. So the police shot the terrorists. This is still the object, the complement of the VP here. But then with rifles, it's just something that we're describing, using to describe or modify the VP. So it attaches up here at a higher level, but otherwise still looks the same. Yeah, so like I said before, this is what is called a modifier of the VP rather than a complement. Shot here is a transitive verb, so the police shot. You have to have some sort of object after that, so this NP has to fill into this slot. This is where you expect the complements to be, and this is just sort of acting as a modifier, sort of describing that action without necessarily having to be there. So you can say the police shot the terrorists by itself. If you say the police shot with rifles, that sounds a little bit odd. You can't just have a modifier without a complement. I have gotten a question about why we have this V-bar structure here, what level of structure this is supposed to help represent, and that's kind of what it's there for, is to distinguish between complements, like things that actually have to be after the verb, and things that do not actually have to be after the verb, like a prepositional phrase in this, or this modifier here. Okay, so I wanted to walk through what the quick write was all about. So in this case, there's a little girl who runs to the tennis courts with her tennis racket, and then someone says she wants to play tennis really badly. And so this is kind of a funny little expression, because what we've got here is what we're going to call a adverb phrase. There's a degree word really, and the whole head of the adverb phrase is badly, which is an adverb by itself. And this, the literal interpretation of this is really badly is poorly, but it also can be used as an intensifier. In this case, that's how it's being used. So say she wants to play tennis really badly, that means she really, really wants to play tennis. And you can sort of interpret that or misinterpret that another way, which is to say that it's actually modifying this verb play instead. So it's fitting in as a modifier here for this VP. So she wants to play tennis really badly, like she wants to be really bad at the game of tennis. Then that adverb phrase would fit in here. And I really don't have enough room to make all this structure explicit, so I'm glossing over some of this as well. Don't do that either in your homework exercises, but this is basically the idea that we're trying to get across. This is how this ambiguity works. Does the adverb phrase attach up there as a modifier of that VP, or does it attach as the modifier of that VP down there? All right, I'm going to pause here because I think I've said enough for one video, but I have a short video after this that I want to make. And also, I'm going to make some videos for the practice exercises, for the third practice exercise set, which incorporates some of these concepts in them. Okay, so see you later.